Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Procurement notices, funding and grants opportunities, lists of potential partners, insights into market trends, databases of development professionals, webinars, latest news, and much more. Stay informed and connected. Visit developmentaid.org today and see how we can help you achieve your sustainable development goals together.
Hello everyone, welcome to Development Aid Dialogues, where we explore the heart of humanitarian aid most critical topics. I'm your host, Hisham Alem. Today we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Jean-Pierre Méan, a prominent lawyer and global expert in anti-corruption efforts. Dr. Méan has served in important positions including Chief Legal Officer at the Aluminium Company of Canada, Chief Compliance Officer at SGS, and General Counsel of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He's also led the Swiss chapter of Transparency International and helped creating the anti-bribery management systems standard ISO 37001. In this episode, we will break down how corruption affects development, discuss ways to fight it through development aid, and explore how digital tools are being used to tackle corruption. Hello, Dr. Méan, and welcome to our podcast.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you to be with us today. It's our pleasure. Dr. Méan, let's start by understanding the root of the problem. What are the underlying factors that contribute corruption in developing countries such as weak governance, lack of transparency, and poverty?
Well, weak governance is certainly a major factor in contributing to corruption. Weak governance means that you don't have an independent judiciary. If you don't have an independent judiciary, it means that judges can be bribed and that their decisions will not be according to the law, but according to who has paid the bribe. The same applies to decisions of the administration. If the administration is corrupt, when you apply for decisions of the administration, for permits, for exemptions, etc., the decisions which may be taken will not reflect justice, in fact. Another phenomenon is state capture in certain countries, and that was the case in Ukraine. I don't know how it is now, but certainly it was in the case in Ukraine before the war, that an oligarchy operating outside of the political structure in the background was really dominating the administration and all the instruments, all the sectors of the state. So that's, of course, very negative to development. Another important factor, you have mentioned poverty, but actually in country where there is a large inflow of funds in relation with the development of natural resources, this is a cause of corruption. Also, in countries that are at war or after the war, the inflow of large sums of money is a source of corruption of a certain group of people.
To take it a step further, how does corruption hinder development efforts by diverting resources, undermine trust, and creating a hostile business environment?
Well, corruption is a hidden force that operates in the background. It nullifies the operation of the instruments or the rules that are supposed to protect property rights, to create an environment of predictability and impartiality, which is essential for business to prosper. So the allocation of resources is biased because the allocation is based on who pays the highest bribes rather than who has the best product or the best services at the best price. So the most productive and the most efficient suppliers of goods and services are not those that will be selected, and that's not good for development, of course.
So if we look at real-world scenarios, and from your rich background and expertise, can you share case studies that illustrate the real-world consequences of corruption on development projects such as infrastructure projects, healthcare initiatives, and education programs?
Yes, I mean, there are some funny cases in India or Nepal of bridges built where there is no road to access the bridge. And that's because it's easier to build a bridge at a high cost, of course, and get a fat bribe without having to wait for the road to be built. So there are some examples of these bridges in Nepal, in the Gorkha district, or in Bihar in India. They were built. The only reason why they were built was that somebody wanted to get a bribe. There is also evidence of earthquakes killing more people in countries affected by widespread corruption. There was a case, for example, in Takya in Turkey, and an earlier case in Izmir, I think, where many buildings collapsed, although they should not have collapsed, because the building codes, especially with respect to earthquakes, reflected the building codes of California. California has very sensitive to earthquakes, and they have very strict building codes. So the buildings should not have collapsed, or not to the same extent, but they did, because the material that was used was cheap material. It was not what was supposed to be used, and so on. In Kenya, in relation with the COVID, was of course accompanied with a lot of corruption. And Kenya, I think, has been established that cartels sold COVID vaccines for amounts that are very, very high for Kenya, $150 per portion. One of the most famous cases, however, is the M1MDB case in Malaysia. That's one of the largest corruption case. It was organized and it was monitored by the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, by the way. So it was a fund that was supposed to use monies for development projects, to invest in those projects. But those projects were projects that were of little benefit to the population, to the normal citizens. But again, their main reason was to have a bribe attached to them. If you look at Brazil, for example, when the World Cup was organized in Brazil, and also an Olympic stadium built for the World Cup, and it was also oversized, so that if you get 5 or 10% of a project, you really want the project to be as expensive as possible.
Yes.
That means your bribe is higher. Another third case is the Lusaka airport, I think, in Zambia, which was also a white elephant. This project are called white elephants.
So how development aid can address these issues? What strategies can development organizations employ to mitigate corruption risks, such as strengthening accountability mechanisms, promoting transparency?
First step is to inform the public of what corruption is, because often they don't know.
Who should do this?
NGOs, organizations, or the government as well, but certainly it's something that NGOs do. The most famous one is Transparency International, of course, and they can do this.
Sorry for interruption. You mean raising the public awareness about the problem?
Raising the public awareness and the sensitivity. In certain country, if you start to talk about corruption and say that, well, why do ministers, they will tell you, well, it's normal. I mean, they are in these offices. They would be stupid if they didn't take the opportunity to get rich. So it's necessary to change this state of mind and to show how the impact that corruption can have. If you take, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, when Mobutu, that's a long time ago, but when he died, the foreign debt of the country was the same amount as Mobutu had masterpro in hidden accounts. It's very important that those who are implementing the anti-corruption efforts are innerly convinced of their justification. You cannot be successful if you believe that corruption is just a way to grease the system and to make things more easy. That's especially required of the leaders, of course. The leaders of an organization are those that define the environment. So the second step is to implement anti-corruption measures. One such measure is the asset disclosure by public servants and politicians at a certain level, so that their assets are known, that they should report every year and publish what they own, so that you can see what if there is in 1 year a high increase. Well, it would not happen. I mean, if assets were published regularly, of course, it would.
You mean the financial disclosure?
Yes,
Yeah,
the financial assets.
there-
That's been introduced in certain countries, but I'm not sure that it works very well, because people are able to hide monies, to hide their funds. But if it's done very seriously, that's certainly a very effective way to curb corruption.
But in several cases that I have personally witnessed, that politicians, politically exposed persons, public servants, they use the laws to hide the money that they get from illicit way, using offshore networks of companies, registries, tax havens. So, and I was following what Transparency International used to do regarding this. Don't you think that it is not sufficient? It is not working properly with them. They knew how to overcome this.
I'll give you an example. I mean, I once received a message that was distributed to many lawyers, saying, well, just at the time where Cyprus had difficulties, and Cyprus is an offshore center for Eastern country for Russia and Ukraine. And so that was somebody was saying, well, Cyprus, it is financial difficulties, but now we can offer you in Latvia even a better service. And so I answered, thank you, but if I form a company in Latvia, will my clients be obliged to disclose their identity? And the reply came, yes. I mean, you have to disclose the identity of the shareholders of a company in Latvia, but we will use as shareholder a British non-resident company, and nobody will know the identity of your client. So this is exactly, I mean, what you described. We have laws, we publish laws, and we also have, or we tolerate, ways to circumvent them. And these offshore centers, in my view, have little justification. In some countries, people would not want people to know how much they own or how rich they are, because that could encourage kidnapping, that could encourage ransoming. But this is not the main use of these offshore centers. The main use of these offshore centers is to hide money to the tax authorities and to hide monies that have been obtained illegally, like corruption. I would like to list all the measures that can be implemented, if that's okay with you.
Yes,
Then you have the asset disclosure, but you also have, those measures that are foreseen in anti-corruption instruments like ISO 37001. You may require business to implement anti-corruption programs with a policy on corruption, with training programs for personnel, with policies on gifts and entertainment and travel expenses. Due diligence on business partners, quite important as well. Integrity clauses in all contracts, and also a channel to report concerns in confidence and also anonymously required. So these are the measures that can be put in place.
The tax avoidance is a flourishing industry for the tax havens. And about the example that you gave, there is a rule that obligates banks and financial organizations to know your client. You have to know who is your client during the due diligence process. So for some time, they provide this secrecy to encourage corrupted people to hide their money through their networks. So not to be pessimistic, Can you highlight some successful examples of development initiatives that have effectively addressed corruption and promoted good governance?
Transparency International is one of the main organizations fighting corruption. So, they publish every year a corruption perceptions index. And the corruption perceptions index has been very successful at encouraging countries to implement anti-corruption measures, because it's reliable only to a certain extent, because corruption is something that goes on, it is secret, that is not in the open. But it's the best measure we have, and countries look at the anti-corruption perceptions index every year, and they look if they've been going up or down, or they try to improve their ranking. So that's efficient. Some countries have improved or made good progress, but some countries have gone down, actually, in the countries implementing the anti-corruption measures against corruption of foreign public servants. There are only 2 countries that are really implementing these measures.
Which are?
The US and Switzerland.
Okay.
The US and Switzerland, the UK used to be one of the country, and this is because they are financial centers. So they are in the limelight as far as corruption is concerned. In the US, if you go to Miami, a lot of the real estate is owned by South Americans. The Trump Tower in New York,
Yes.
several apartments are owned by Russian, and you wonder where all this money comes from. In Switzerland, of course, you had the banking secrecy, which long exists, that was offering a safe harbor and in the UK, but the UK is no longer in this group because not been seen as being active enough. But
the tax havens and the registries, most of them are in the UK, Cayman Islands.
And they are operated by English lawyers. It's a little group of English lawyers, and the local population derives little benefit from their activity. You have also real estate in London. It's called actually Londograd on the Thames, owned by Russian oligarchs. And you can even take a tour of London on a bus, going to look at all these properties owned by Russian oligarchs.
We had in the Middle East a model that used to be called the Middle East Switzerland. I'm speaking about, but recently the financial system collapsed and the country is managing according to this kind of fatal corruption system.
Yes, I think it's no longer playing an important role. Dubai is, of course, a financial center that replaces Switzerland to a certain extent.
You have given us a couple of examples about the bridge and the stadium in Brazil. So how or what are the implications of corruption that lead to substandard infrastructure projects, inflated costs and delays? How does corruption lead to this?
Well, for infrastructure projects, of course, the allocation of resources is biased by corruption. So the infrastructure projects are not allocated to the most efficient bidder, or to the bidder with the best project and at the best price. The cost of the bribe is factored into the cost of the project, of course, when the bribe have to be paid. So they are considered as a cost of the project. They are generally not presented in the accounts of the payer as bribes, but presented as a commercial commission, marketing expenses. And they are part of the cost of the project, and they are for the benefit of the whole, only of the benefit of some government officials, and they don't come into the country. They are hidden elsewhere. So these are resources that are withdrawn from the country. And we saw before, there is little incentive to keep the project costs down. On the contrary, the incentive is to have a high cost so that but your percentage is more. In healthcare, there is a direct influence of corruption. Now it starts in the emergency room, where you can jump the queue if you pay a bribe. Or the worst I have seen in this instance, in the case of 2 doctors in the emergency room of a hospital, who had an agreement with the funeral home. And the agreement was that they would not prolong, in quotation marks, prolong unnecessarily the life of their patients and deliver them to the funeral home. So this is something absolutely horrible.
Where was this?
It was in a country in the Balkans. And actually, those two doctors were not even fired. So you can jump the queue. You have another case cited by Transparency of a woman in St. Petersburg, I think, who went to the doctor, and the doctor told her, you have to have this surgery. You have something quite important and you need surgery. And the doctor expected a bribe, but when the bribe did not come, the diagnosis changed. In fact, you are inoperable. So you see, that's how this can affect people's lives directly. In education, corruption can influence the choice of teachers. Teachers are maybe not the best placed to pay bribes, but they may be related to somebody, to an important politician and so on, and they may be chosen because of this intervention of this person. Also, one thing which is relatively widespread is the expectation of professors to receive a bribe when they give the grade. That the bribes influence the grades, or the bribes can influence the promotion to a new level. There is this Operation Varsity Blues in the US. I don't know whether you have confronted this, where rich parents were paying bribes, important bribes, to have their children admitted to first-class university or colleges. One other thing which is relatively frequent in some countries is to expect the bribes to be paid in sexual favors. So to extract sexual favors from girls most of the time to give them better grades.
Yeah, this is shameful. So now let's move to the role of international bodies in combating corruption. What role do international organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF play in combating corruption?
So the United Nations, or under the United Nations, convention has been into the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, known as this is a very comprehensive instrument. 191 parties to it, practically all members of the United Nations and practically all countries of the world have ratified or have signed the convention. It has an implementation mechanism, a review mechanism, where you review the countries regularly to see what they have done to fight corruption. The review mechanism is also there to facilitate exchange of information, the information on practices, experience, and so on. And the UNCAC is monitored by the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime in Vienna. So, it's a very good instrument, but the impact of it is still to come. The World Bank and the regional development banks, the EBRD, which I know well, I think I worked there, the African Development Bank and the Asia Development Bank are also devoting important resources to fight corruption. They have integrity departments, they conduct investigations, they keep a list of companies or individuals that are blacklisted. These lists are publicly available. Of course, on these lists, you find small companies and individuals. You do not find many large multi-billion-dollar companies. But anyways, this is effective to a certain extent. In Africa, the African Development Bank has also a department on fighting corruption, and I've recently met the head of this department, who is quite active and knowledgeable about anti-corruption. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it's a group mostly of rich countries. But in the framework of the OECD, a convention has been signed on combating bribery of foreign public officials. So these countries who are not on the receiving end of bribes, but who are rather on the giving end of bribes. They are the countries hosting companies that might pay bribes in developing countries. So 46 countries that have signed or ratified this convention. So most of them are rich, but now some less developed countries like Peru, Brazil, and South Africa have also joined the convention. This instrument is probably the most effective international document in fighting corruption.
This is interesting. Do you have something in mind, like a mechanism or a digital mechanism that enable citizens to report corruption, or helps governments or international organizations document and to receive complaints against corruption?
Well, I think the African Development Bank, to take Africa, would take information on corruption. I'm sure they have a hotline where you can either a telephone line or a dedicated email address and things like this in the other development banks as well, where you can file a complaint or you can make a report at the World Bank. So this possibility exists. There is also a criminal law convention of the Council of Europe, including all Eastern European countries, and there is this law convention on fighting corruption. So these are the instruments. Now, the regional efforts to fight corruption, there is an UNCAC coalition, an NGO, an UNCAC coalition of 350 civil society organizations in many countries. And this coalition has an African branch, the African Anti-Corruption Platform for Sub-Saharan Africa, it's called, that provides a platform to support civil society in fighting corruption and working on corruption. I'm sure that they also have a hotline where you can report cases.
Now I'd like to talk about the role of standards, ISO 37001 and ISO 37301. First, please, what is the difference between the two standards, and how these standards change the landscape of corporate compliance and governance?
So 37001 is focusing on anti-corruption. 37301 is really a good governance compliance guide. So 37001 is much more focused than 37301. There are two kinds of ISO standards. Guidance standards, then you can get the standard and use it as guidance as you like, or the requirements standards like 37001 that have requirements that you have to fulfill if you want to be certified under the standard. So 37001 has been requirement standard since the beginning. 37301 was first a guidance standard and became later a requirement standard. That's why 37301 has not been used to the same extent as 37301. It's been popular, especially in Asia and South America. There are very few. When I look at the certification case, in the accredited certification, there have been very few in Africa and the Middle East, but there have been quite a lot, especially in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other Asian countries, and in South America, especially in Mexico. With the certification, you can show that you have put into place measures to fight corruption, that you have an anti-corruption policy, and this has been examined, audited by an independent auditor. So that's the advantage that people see in the standard, is that they can show to authorities. It's not a conclusive conclusive evidence. It is a serious element. I mean, if there is a certification, there is a certification report. I mean, I've done quite a few of those. Then you can see how somebody has implemented the standards and how seriously they have done it.
Many organizations face challenges when it comes to governance and compliance. What are the common challenges that organizations face when they are implementing anti-bribery management systems, for example?
The first challenge is to make sure that everybody is on the same page. I mean, if you put a standard in place like this, must be convinced at all levels, but certainly at the top of the organization, it is the right thing to do. That you don't do that for just to show that you have done, pretend or to show that you have done something, but you must be convinced of it. I think that's the first challenge, and you have to convince also people at other levels of the organization. Once the tone from the top is there, you will notice that in the organization there will be some reluctance. Some people will say, well, there are countries where you can't do business without corruption, without paying bribes. Others will tell you, oh, we're not really paying bribes, we are using intermediaries. And of course, we don't really know what they do, but they are very well connected, and there are all kinds of justifications, or it's not a real bribe, it's a present. You have to make sure that this conviction permeates through the organization. Then another area, more practical area, where the challenge is gifts and entertainment, donations, etc. Even if you have decided to no longer to pay any bribes. Some people may think that, it's okay to entertain people in lavish way, to invite them for a 1-week vacation in a touristic place and so on. So you have to watch this as well. And then you have to make the resources, personal and financial resourcing available, because you cannot just say, we'll take somebody in legal or in personnel and they will do all the work. And no, you have to have sufficient resources made available. And it's a challenge because often people think that, it's not even a full-time position.
I would like to discuss with you the legal and ethical framework which is critical in fighting corruption. How important is protecting whistleblowers in anti-corruption efforts?
So the ethical framework is extremely important because often people will have to change their personal ethics when an anti-corruption system is introduced. Whistleblowers are important. It's important to have a whistleblower policy and to protect whistleblowers. I have managed several hotlines, and it is difficult. I mean, whistleblowers should be protected. Sometimes they have also their own objectives. If somebody reports that their boss is paying bribes or has an arrangement with a supplier or something, does it matter whether he does that because he doesn't like his boss or because he is ethical? I think in both cases you have to investigate and make sure that the situation is corrected. Now, how efficient the protection is, I have certain doubts. I think the best protection of whistleblowers is anonymity. If anonymity is possible, and in many cases, I have had some anonymous reports, and I knew in about 5 minutes who was behind them because just where it comes from and so on. But anonymity is really the best protection. In spite of all the protection, I've had the case, for example, with a very large company where there was a whistleblower. And as to the protection of the whistleblower, somebody in the company asked, we have had this guy who blew the whistle, can't we fire him? And the answer of the ethical officer or the compliance officer was, you can't do anything for 2 years. That was the answer. So you cannot avoid somebody being isolated. That's quite difficult.
During your long and rich experience in fighting corruption, what is the most learned lesson or the most impressive case you have witnessed during your career journey?
Well, I've had several high points. I've had, for example, once to defend a position in front of one of the leader in the automotive industry in Europe, I must say, who was shouting at me, and that was certainly a highlight. I must say that I maintained my position that a certain transaction was very suspicious and that probably a bribe was involved. And I must say that after shouting and a lot of commotion, this person said, okay, if the compliance officers that says that we can't do it, we won't do it, or we won't do it like that. So it was efficient. Also, I was involved in a company who was being prosecuted for corruption, and the company had paid bribes and significant amounts. And now it was facing prosecution, it was facing the press, it was facing the World Bank was going to blacklist the company. And back then, there were arrangements with a lot, about 30 contracts with people who were receiving bribes, and the bribes were paid over time. There were agreements that ran for about 10 years, where they were receiving a percentage of a business every year. So I said, well, we have to terminate this contract. So
they are bribe shareholders? Bribe
Yes.
shareholders, yes, or kind of salary.
Yes. So we told them, well, you have to go to these people and you have to tell them that we will no longer be able to make these payments. So we had a discussion and said, well, okay, we allow you to tell them that you are going to pay for another 3 months or 6 months, not more than 6 months. But then it's over. People were saying, oh, well, I will not be able to go to that country any longer. I have my legs broken and so on. But it didn't happen. This agreement were terminated. And actually, the company saved a lot of money.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Jean-Pierre Méan, for sharing your valuable insights and expertise with us today. In today's conversation, we have gained a deeper understanding of the challenges corruption poses to development and innovative solutions being implemented to combat it. To our listeners, stay tuned for more provoking discussions here on Development Aid Dialogues. Until next time, this is your host, Hisham Alam, signing it off.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.